Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 p.m. in San Francisco, it's 5 p.m. in New York, and it is 7 a.m. here in Melbourne, Australia. Thanks for joining us on Made In. I am here again with Ron Keith, and we have three guests, kind of a panel style today, which I'm pretty excited about. Ron, how's your week been? What's been going on? What have people been vexing you with this week with respect to supply chain and where stuff gets made?
I'm doing pretty well. I am getting ready, or I'm getting a little bit antsy with the lockdown, as I think everybody is here in Sonoma County. We're lifting things a little bit, but I see that our governor just about an hour ago, said that everyone has to wear a mask outdoors everywhere, or I'm sorry, indoors everywhere in the state, which is kind of new. Our cases are a little bit high. I think you saw this week that Beijing had a little flare up, and it's impressive how quickly they can act on that. They're not letting anybody in or out of that area in and around the market. They've shut a bunch of stuff down. They've shut schools down now there until at least November. So, they act very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's been impressive throughout. I've kind of been watching how it's been happening from here in Australia, watching how it's been occurring in different places around the world, and interviewing a lot of EMS CEOs over the last couple of weeks, and everybody that's got facilities in China said, when they lock down, it happens fast, it happens in a controlled way, and everybody does what they're told to do, and I think that's served them well, and that's let's hope there isn't too big a flare up on the kind of second wave issue, because I think that's a big challenge facing people right now.
On the supply chain news side, at least here in the U.S., a couple of items that I either tweeted about or did something on LinkedIn about. Trump administration now is toying with the idea of a $2 trillion manufacturing stimulus to try and bring, more manufacturing, back home. And, to put that in perspective, there are 7 countries in the world whose economy is even $2 trillion in size. And so a single stimulus of $2 trillion, I talked about that a little bit, and that's an awful lot of money. And I'm not opposed to having some stimulus and bringing some manufacturing back home, but there's no good place to deploy that much. I mean, you could make really good inroads with, about $50 billion a year for 5 years, and really working on some of the infrastructure issues. Yeah. And then I saw, I think it was a Republican senator, which was a little bit surprising, suggesting that we put some tariffs on all medical devices being imported. And so I posted some stuff on that. I posted kind of a world map of, where we get our medical devices from, which, you can find that on the SCRG website. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, no, I think there's some fascinating stuff going on worldwide around stimulus, and I think I'm kind of curious where these people get their advice from some of the time, because some of the numbers are, as you say, ridiculous. But the concern is that number's spent in the wrong way. And I was talking to someone actually on the sustainability side yesterday, actually ex-sustainability czar of both Facebook and Google. And he was talking about this Build Back Better policy, and the fact that, we can't just keep throwing money at fossil fuels and all those kind of things. We need to have a strategy where what we do invest these billions and potentially trillions of dollars in is sustainable, both from a planet and climate point of view, but also sustainable from a business model point of view. There's no point in spending $2 trillion trying to build Shanghai in California, because it's not going to work. So you need to have another strategy. Part of the reason for today's panel was because we've had a lot of questions over the last 2 weeks. Had some fantastic conversations with some very senior people, but a lot of also very senior people in our audience that have asked some really good questions that we haven't managed to get to. So we're going to try and get to some of those, and I'm sure we'll touch on topics like the role of the government. If anybody's got more questions, please put them in the Q&A box or in the chat window, and we'll try and get to those as well. but Ron, let's introduce our guests and get them on and see where this takes us.
Sure. I want to jump in with one other thing. I was reading something this morning, and I apologize. I don't know where. I think it was maybe South China Morning Post. Maybe it was in Fortune, but I don't know if you know Christian Lang. He's the CEO of TradeShift, which provides kind of supply chain marketplace data.
Yeah.
He had a couple of interesting quotes, and we're talking to Mondello and getting his view on inventory, and McNamara was a lot more precise about how he thinks about inventory and how it lubricates the system and stuff. And Christian Long said, in this piece I was reading, he said, as a starting point, we need to understand that the just-in-time model is completely broken.
Yeah.
And its sole focus on unit cost and its slash and burn management policies around inventory have been fatally flawed for years. If you plug in a huge disruption every 5 years, which I assume he's talking about COVID, almost all modern supply chains have become hyper optimized for efficiency and are lacking in any kind of resilience and redundancy. So I'll forward that to you. I'll probably put that up. I'll probably post that up on LinkedIn. It's a really interesting article.
Yeah, and maybe we should get him on and have a word with him at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to. So we've got 3 guests today. Our first one is Ron Tarter. Ron most recently was the COO of Phononics, which makes a solid state air conditioning and cooling system. Prior to that, Ron's been with a number of companies, including Apple, something I don't like to talk about, but also was with the LA Dodgers for a while. And Ron was the senior vice president of Flex for about 20 years and managed operations in probably 20 different countries. So that, let's bring Ron on. Hello, Mr. Tarter.
Hello, thanks, Ron.
And next we have Bill Biancaniello. Bill, I've known Bill I've worked for Bill early in my career. One of my mentors for several decades. Bill was a division president for Pentair. He ran their electronics packaging division for a number of years. One of the things I find interesting about Bill's experience, more so than some of the rest of the panel today, is he probably has the most experience running captive manufacturing. A lot of our guests are from the EMS world, in part because so much of stuff gets done by contract manufacturers today. But when Bill was at Pentair, he oversaw captive factories building his own products in the US, Mexico, China, Brazil, and also Germany. More recently, he was COO of Integris, a technology startup, and president of ESSI, which was an aftermarket reverse logistics company. So, Mr. Bill.
Welcome, Bill.
There he is.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate it.
And then I think a lot of you folks know Mark Medlin. Mark and I have worked together on and off for most of our careers. Mark most recently was the chief operating officer of Harry's, the men's grooming equipment company, but has also spent time at Flex, Abbott Labs, Texas Instruments, Micron, and some time at Joule, actually. So, Mr. Medlin.
Thanks, Ron. Philip, thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Great stuff. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us. A fantastic panel today. I wanted to kind of open with a really kind of basic question and kind of go round the table, because a lot of what we get asked on this show is where stuff needs to be made in, hence the name of the show. So I really wanted to explore the fundamentals of what makes a good manufacturing geography. So, when we look at existing geographies, when we look at new geographies, what are the key elements we're looking for a manufacturing geography? And Bill, I'm really curious, because you come at it from the slightly different angle of someone that's run OEM factories. What do you see as the key fundamentals to selecting a good manufacturing geography?
Yeah, I think I see a couple of points. One is, is it a fully functioning supply chain? I mean total, from raw materials through equipment suppliers, the support infrastructure? Does it, and does it have the education and training capabilities for the talent you need to run it? Is the infrastructure capable? Communications, transportation, logistics. Thirdly, obviously it's cost. Is the cost structure, but not only labor cost, but total cost of manufacture. I think those are probably the three biggest keys. It's not rocket science. Those are pretty much things that you cover all the time. But I think most important is to think of supply chain as a total chain. It's not just about low-cost manufacturing.
Yeah, it's about getting all those elements. Ron, Tarter.
Thanks, Phil. As I was thinking about the question, it's kind of made me reminded about even geographies within a region. So if you think about the United States, and why has, for example, the South been pretty attractive to, a variety of manufacturers, both, international as well as domestic. And kind of what you're seeing there is a collaboration between industry and government. The governments of many of the southern states have been very active in trying to figure out different ways to attract, the large manufacturers and the large OEMs. So maybe one of the great stories is the fact that a Boeing decided to leave, not necessarily leave, but actually to expand its operation from the Washington State, Seattle-based area and go all the way to South Carolina and Charleston. And that really had a lot to do with an economic organization that was paramount to try to go attract a variety of companies. And today, South Carolina has Mercedes, it has BMW, it has a number of companies because early on they started to figure out how to partner. Governments, you want a government that's going to be reflective, that is a little bit open-minded about how you might want to take care of a big, large OEM, and South Carolina has been pretty successful the last few years.
Yeah, and I think that whole the role of government, the role of incentives, how that's going to play out in the long term is really, really pretty important to how you select a geography. But to what Bill was saying, it's also relevant to skills and all the other things that are going to be developed in that area, and is the infrastructure going to be built on. Mark, what did we miss?
I think they hit pretty much all the points. I mean, the key is it depends on what you're building and what you want to build and what your product is. I give you a lot of examples, but I've got a ton of experience in China, and I think McNamara said this a few weeks ago, but it is still the world's factory as far as electronics. So moving your final assembly and test to Mexico, your supply chain still is mostly coming from China. So you really got to look at what's the real value of just doing that final assembly and test in Mexico or anywhere else, and maybe even the United States, if most of your supply chain is there. But if you can centralize your supply chain, one of the great things about China is everything's there. When part of my career, I was fortunate enough to be part of a group at Flex that designed the Apple charger, the little square cube. And, it was just absolutely amazing to me because I spent a lot of time with Apple and with our factory in China. And, we did these iterations on just tooling where, we needed I call it Chinamation, but a simple little inspection or assembly tool, a few $1,000, but we would go to our supplier who was right down the street, 2 or 3 suppliers, go over the concept with them. They'd build one. We'd try it the next morning. That didn't work as well. We would iterate it again. And I've never seen that anywhere else in the world, the ability to go do that like they can do it in China.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because that was the other thing that Mike McNamara was talking to us about. It was, particularly with PPE and stuff, the ability to crank stuff up and stand stuff up really quickly is absolutely unique, and that was why it was natural for them to go to China and fix those specific issues, because they knew they could not just get the product stood up quickly, but crank up volume at an incredible rate. Ron, Keith, where do you what do you see beyond what's already been discussed on that topic?
Yeah, I think Bill, hit the important part, which is the most important part is that ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And, China's been getting more and more expensive, for 15 years. And, nobody I know who's a real practitioner says, hey, China is the low cost place. It's still a pretty low cost place. It's a very efficient place to get things done, but not necessarily the lowest cost. And so as people, maybe with a little bit less years of experience in it, or with less different, geographies under their belt, look for new locations, people try to revisit in an over amplified way this sense of labor arbitrage, right? Well, and the first thing they want to talk about is, what are the labor rates between here and there, right? And if labor rates was the primary factor or the secondary factor, right, then we would build everything in Tanzania or Namibia or Angola, right, where someone makes 11 cents an hour, but they don't know how to run the machines, and there's no supply chain there, there's no infrastructure there, and the roads suck, and all these types of things. So I think one thing that I haven't heard anybody talk about is the size of the market, right? When I first started building stuff in China, although China has a lot of people, it didn't have much of a consumer market in terms of spending, right? The amount of discretionary income was relatively low, and that's just accelerating very, very rapidly. But now I think, especially coming out of the virus, there's going to be more and more people looking at what is the attractiveness of that market. Mark and I did a project for a company previously mentioned, a year or so ago, and they had a particular product that looked like it was going to sell an awful lot in Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia is, 270 million people. Everybody thinks it's an island, but there's an awful lot of people there. And so, it's very hard to sell an electronic product into a market like that where disposable income is so low, where, average monthly wages are $112. It's hard to think of importing that from someplace else that's more expensive and then selling it in that market. So I think more and more it's also about what is the attractiveness of either that country market or at least that regional market.
Yeah. And when we look at regionalized manufacturing, actually knowing where the market is key to that. What I want to ask all of you, and don't wait to be asked specifically, just butt in if you've got an answer. But what I'm curious is, there was no discussion there specifically about the risk profile of those specific geographies. So when we look at things pre-COVID and post-COVID, it's kind of shifted some people's mindsets in terms of, what's important. Ron already mentioned that things like just-in-time are a little bit broken, and we're more of a just-in-case strategy. When you look at a geography, do you see some geographies as being more risky or some geographies as being less risky? And what are those risks? Mark, you're smiling, so I'm going to come to you first.
Well, at the beginning of COVID, I would have said China was super risky, but I think they've done pretty well recovering from it, right? So they have the ability to control the inputs and the outputs in a certain area and lock down areas where I live in Texas, and it's kind of a free for all kind of a little bit here, and I feel uncomfortable going to places without a mask, even the gym. So it again depends. It's not just for me the medical risk. There's all kinds of risks, right?
Yeah, of course.
There's risks of tsunamis and hurricanes, and I think you need to go look at it at a holistic view of risk. And it's the one thing that I've seen very few companies in my career, a lot of clients, et cetera, very few people really understand what a supply chain risk assessment is and how to go about doing it and why it's important. And they're clearly not incentivized to do it by their bosses.
Yeah, I think that incentive thing's huge. Yeah, that incentive thing's huge. And if you're only incentivized to take a couple of points out each quarter, then that's what you're going to focus on. And buying insurance isn't what gets people promoted. If they'd bought insurance and that had paid out recently, maybe they would have got a promotion. But when you're looking to put a plant somewhere for an OEM, how big a part of that picture of your overall supply chain is that risk analysis, and what post-COVID would be the way you think about that process?
I kind of agree with Mark. I don't know that post-COVID, it may have made us awareness a little bit more. But I think if anything's come out of post-COVID, it is that, we're concerned about China, but China has ramped up so rapidly from the downturn that, and again, it gets back to Ron's point of the ecosystem. It's been such ingrained, and we've spent the last 25 years building that infrastructure that even though we had this global pandemic, their ability to ramp back up quickly, and that's a big risk concern. Obviously, Mark's mentioned it. There's all kinds of risks. No matter where you are in the world, there's going to be a risk of something, whether it's political turmoil or it's some kind of natural disaster. It's how quickly you can recover from that that's key. So, obviously when, from the OEM space, we always look to say, if we already have other capabilities in that space, should we expand that space versus, opening up a new facility somewhere else? So, it's as much about recovery from a disaster, because we're not going to stop disaster. There is always going to be some shakeup, either in the economy or the natural disasters, that's going to cause a problem in supply chain. It's how quickly you can recover.
Yeah, so those recovery plans become fundamental. And as you mentioned about China, it's just, it's not like a small single country. It's very big. And if there's a problem in Wuhan, then there's a whole lot of manufacturing in Shenzhen, and it doesn't go across those. Ron, Tarter, when you look at that, do you think about the ability of, or the type of government and the ability of the government to control stuff? You look at Texas and you think everybody's just out there doing their own thing, and you look at China and everybody's doing what they're told. It's kind of a different thing. Does that make you think differently about risk analysis?
I think it's an element. I think that, some of the things that Mark said and Bill said both, that make sense. And what are they really kind of, if you're going to summarize it, you want as diversified a supply chain as you can get, as well as a diversified supply chain that perhaps even you can manage. We can all say that we want, this tremendous supply chain. Maybe it's worldwide based. It has a number of elements to it. But in the end, I think it gets down to looking at the weakest link in your supply chain. Again, Mark made a reference to this, but if you're mapping your supply chain and you're understanding where your limitations are, and you can put in an understanding of how you might deal with the variations that occur. Back to Bill's point, things are going to happen. It's a thing that we can guarantee. Supply chains are never going to be static. They're always going to be dynamic. The ones who win are the ones who know how to respond when the variation takes care. And if you have more diversity, you're going to win.
Yeah. Ron, Keith, on a holistic point of view, how do you assess risk across an entire supply chain, when you're maybe looking at multiple geographies, and how has your mindset changed with respect to that as we've gone through this crisis?
So, it's interesting. There are a lot of people in industry and practitioners that are now newly finding the academic literature about this. And, the academic literature has been pretty ripe for the last, decade and a half on supply chain resilience and recovery. And, Bill was talking about how fast it recovers. And, in academic circles, the most widely embraced metric of the resiliency of a supply chain is the recovery time, right? And I don't necessarily agree with this part of it, but they manage recovery time as two elements. The first part of that recovery time is how long are you down, right? And so it's the event itself. And then there's the response to the event, right? And so if you think about your output as having a V, right? All of a sudden your output drops. You want to get your output back up to the other side of that V. And so what academicians have done for years is they measure the width of that gap from the 2 points of the V. And they measure that as a percentage of normalized lead time, right? And so if normally you have a product lead time of 13 weeks, for example, and between the disruption and your response to it and returning back to normal, if you can do that in 6 weeks, then your resiliency score would be a 0.5, right? I'm not sure I agree with how you measure the denominator, but it really is, unless you can predict the future with great accuracy, it really is about how do you go recover. But back to your original question, a little bit about, risk and how you think about it. Country-specific risk has always been about kind of geopolitical, right?
Yeah.
Until the Trump era. And then, there's kind of this self-imposed geopolitical, which is, tariffs and things like that. When you have a country the size of China, any kind of natural disaster risk or things like that, I mean, it's just so big, you can mitigate some of that by having plants in different regions and, not building on an earthquake zone or inside a volcano and stuff like that. But if you're in a single country, whether it be Mexico or China, Indonesia, Ukraine, you do have to worry about kind of that geopolitical overhang. I remember Mark and I were doing a project in 2011. And, Mark needed to go to a factory in Tunisia as part of this project. Well, all of a sudden, the country of Tunisia is shut down because of, the Arab Spring.
Arab Spring,
right? Doesn't matter if you have 2 or 3 different factories in different parts of Tunisia, right? Because the factory shut down. Just like in China, when China was shut down, China shut down. So, you need to think about the country specific, but generally, risk mitigation is a little bit more about at a slightly more micro level.
Yeah. So one of the questions we constantly get asked is about specific geographies, and not just with respect to risk, just general pros and cons. I've got a list of about 6. I'm going to holler them out, and if anybody's got any pros and cons, just call them out. I am going to start with Mexico. Anybody heard of Mexico?
It's funny, Philip. I just before the COVID pandemic, I went to a full-day seminar hosted by folks in Mexico and kind of the Mexican government about what they're doing to increase the amount of capabilities in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting in terms of, and the educational resources, the training, just the different types of manufacturing capabilities that they're developing. And in terms of, and again, it was about, the whole thing was about, you don't need to be in China, you can be in Mexico. So I think Mexico is obviously a viable location, certainly for us in North America. But Mark mentioned it, there are still certain things that you're, out of the supply chain, they're still going to come from Asia. It's just, there's certain things that Mexico just can't compete with China and the Asian market and, with raw materials and such. So some part of it's still going to be there, but I do think Mexico is a good alternative for some level of your supply chain and to bring it a little bit closer.
And if it was a China plus one, it's an interesting option. It certainly ticks the box in terms of talent. I spent some time, or quite a lot of time over the last few years in Guadalajara, and there's just an immense number of people working and doing great stuff in the electronic manufacturing space down there. Any other comments on Mexico before I move on to my next one?
Well, most of our customers are U.S. customers, and so they try and think about cost and pay their bills in U.S. dollars. And over the last 6 or 7 years, Mexico, from a direct labor perspective, has now become on par with China. A combination of wage inflation in China and currency deflation in Mexico. The costs are not that much different. China still has kind of the productivity trump card, so an hour's worth of labor produces a little bit more. For consumer products, and Ron Tarter and I were talking about this the other day. Almost all the consumer products come out of China and Southeast Asia, but consumer products decline in value more rapidly than infrastructure products and data communications and things like that. And, if you're putting that stuff on a boat, in Tianjin, you're 28 days on the water, right? Probably a couple more days on land to the DC and another couple of days, direct fulfillment. That amount of time, some of that material is going to depreciate 4 or 5%, right? If you're the first one out with that new watch, if you're the first one out with that new router, whatever it is, maybe it's $99, maybe it's $129, but 6 weeks later, it's $99, right? And so the proximity of Mexico, your ability to get something from, Guadalajara to Dallas in, 2 days, and what that does for kind of the curve of that depreciation. Am I depreciating over, 28 to 35 days? Am I depreciating over 2 days? That, and then just the relative cost. I don't know if you saw this week, but container rates coming out of Asia went up 30% this week, right? Which is interesting to me because nobody's shipping anything, right?
Yeah.
Demand is down 20%, rates went up 29%, right? Because everybody just, took their big container ships. They've all got them sitting on anchor, out there off of Shanghai going, look, it doesn't pay for us to move these things around. So, we'll just constrain the capacity and jack up the price.
Yeah. No, it's a strange thing. Okay, let me give you another one that I've been constantly hearing about for the last year, Vietnam. I know you've talked about Vietnam in a couple of articles, Ron, but it seems to be one that people are very interested in. Mark, what do you think?
Well, I think Vietnam definitely is a viable alternative. Its proximity to China, for sure. The similarity, from a sub-supply chain perspective. The similarity, I'm not saying they're similar, but the similarity in, the cultures and the cost of labor is really, really low. But again, at some point, Vietnam will get saturated because it's landlocked. I don't think we're there yet. We've got a ways to go for that, but the ability to move products, especially electronic type products or complex mechanical products from China to Mexico, is relatively simple in our experience.
Yeah. So what do you think are the barriers to the growth of manufacturing in Vietnam? Are there specific barriers? Is it just critical mass?
Well, one of the things
Go ahead, Ron.
One of the things we're finding, we're not a manufacturer, but we help people get their stuff manufactured in Vietnam. Talent. It is a dramatically smaller country with a much shorter history of high-tech manufacturing. And so, it's just a battle royale every day for talent, right? We lost someone on our team this week because, they just got this, really, in my mind, kind of crazy offer. So, that's one of the issues. The internal transportation infrastructure certainly could get a little bit better. If you look at a map and go, okay, I'm going to go from Hanoi to Bac Ninh, and I look at a map and go, hey, in the U.S. that's 20 minutes. Yeah, maybe it's 45, maybe it's 2 hours. Who the hell knows, right? Call me when you get to Bac Ninh and tell me how long it took, right?
Yeah, I guess so. So some other ones that came up. India seems to be constantly talked about as the next China, and it never is. What's up there?
I bet Mr. Tarter has some thoughts on that.
So India. My experience with India is that some of the key challenges were once again the supply chain is primarily going to come from China, and so by default, you're going to lose a couple of points of margin just because you're going to have to pay that extra freight to kind of get that in. The lack of infrastructure for all the electronic components was still lacking. But one of the more interesting things about India that I experienced is that the government is pretty volatile. Even though you can see national things occur, but there's a lot of things can go on at a local level. Yeah. Local level, you can see taxes go up, taxes go down, different types of regulations in and out. So you're in a region and you can get very surprised by unexpected governmental intervention.
Yeah,
and they're not necessarily predictable. The real key about being in India is it's a huge market. Every customer that I worked with wanted to be in India because that was really the way they were going to be able to sell their products. And so understanding that ahead of time, we started trying to put activities in place so we could see where the government was thinking, where they were trying to go, how we could do some different things to kind of manage the supply chain. Because in the end, it's hard to turn down, 900 million people, 1 billion people, or as I recall, maybe 150 million people that have true purchasing power. That's what customers interested in.
Yeah, and that's that regional, make in the region that people are consuming. On that basis, what about the US as a manufacturing location?
I think Bill's got the most
Viability
experience.
like that.
I think Bill's run more plants in the
Yeah.
US than the rest of us have.
That I have. I've run a bunch of them, and I think certainly the U.S. is a great place to manufacture. I think, we in my factories, I had great talent, great people. The interesting thing about U.S. factories is they become multicultural. When you're in China, your folks are all Chinese. In the U.S. factories, I've had factories where I had 50 different languages spoken, with only a few hundred people. So it's a great diversity model. I think there's still a great work ethic in U.S. factories. The situation becomes that it's still really a high cost. There are still some things that make it not a place to manufacture everything. But again, we were doing some very large infrastructure, low volume type products, a lot of automation to the process. So again, it's not a lot of labor, but you fight the cost battle in the U.S. But I do think he said, and Ron mentioned it, we're still doing a lot of manufacturing in the U.S. I think there's a lot of things that can be added back to our manufacturing base, but it's still not, it's still never going to be a China or a low cost place to manufacture, but I think it has its place in the world for some manufacturing capability.
Yeah, and do you think there's an opportunity for it to, perhaps with some incentives for it to be more competitive, providing those incentives are spent on digital transformation, on building better infrastructure, on maybe more automation? What does it need to make it more competitive in the future?
Yeah, I think some of the things you just mentioned, and Ron mentioned earlier about, some governmental help from a stimulus package. I agree. I don't know that $2 trillion is a number, but obviously I think to level the playing field as such, I think some level of investment by the government to be able to bring back some jobs. But you're right, it's in the next generation of manufacturing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I think that digital transformation is huge. That's why this guy's always whispering in my ear, telling me that, robotics and automation are the way to go. There are other countries that I've got on my list, but I'm interested to hear from you guys. What do you see as great alternatives, great up and coming manufacturing locations? We've mentioned stuff like the Ukraine, Philippines, those kind of places. What should we be watching to see if it's the next place? Anybody want to jump in?
Hey, sure. Philip, I'd like to make a point about the U.S. One of the things that has constantly frustrated me, being a supply chain guy in this world, is that, and you guys have talked about it, Ron and I talk about it all the time, is, the PO price that you're paying for a product is really easy to measure. Your COGS are really easy to measure. But I've been in, and I've seen many companies that won't skip a beat to send 8 or 10 people to China to do a relatively menial task that could be done remotely or with boots on the ground in China. So they're not measuring the OCOGs. They're not measuring the total cost of ownership of that supply chain, right? And if you do that, and I'm not saying it happens in every instance, but if you do that more and more, you'll find out that the U.S. can be competitive in some areas, for sure.
Okay.
But yeah. People just don't understand, or they don't measure the OCOGs the way that they should, of what is your cost of running that supply chain, wherever it is in the world.
Yeah. No, I interviewed someone recently that was running the supply chain for, I can't remember whether it was Facebook or Google, but it was a huge company. And he talked about trips where they would take multiple engineers and execs out. And a couple of times there were some problems with the products. So they ended up staying there for 2 weeks. And he reckoned that was about $250,000 for that for that trip in his budget, and he did at least 4 of those a year. So
Yeah.
out of, he got $1 million there just running that 1 or 2 manufacturers. So
Ron,
is there a lack of understanding there?
Ron and I were talking about that last night. Ron, maybe you could elaborate on that and some of the frustration you've seen in the past when you were helping people manage their supply chain, and maybe one anecdote we were talking about.
Yeah, the Ron, what we were talking about is that companies have a tendency, especially I saw it more in maybe larger companies, but they're not managing their total landed cost, total cost of ownership. And really, as Mark was talking about, hey, they get focused on a PO price for either a commodity or a unit, without necessarily knowing what everything else costs in between. And what happens in companies is they kind of get segregated to their own objectives. So someone is worried about the manufacturing costs, someone's worried about the labor costs, someone's worried about the logistics, the distribution costs, and they're driving those things kind of independent of one another. One of my favorite stories about this was a large company who had a supplier in the US for packaging, and they were actually shipping it to China, which doesn't make any sense. This is a very good manufacturing company. But the intent here was whoever owned the logistic budget was achieving the objective they had, because they had to have a certain amount of content in the United States. So they made actually a relatively poor decision, because the logistics organization had an objective that didn't fit across the whole spectrum. To me, one of the real challenges of any company is to try to understand that total landed cost and make decisions not only just on what your variable cost might be, but your cost of capital, what you're doing with inventory in terms of its carrying costs. When you look at all those kinds of things, you can probably make a better decision independent in each of those different categories to try to get the most optimum solution for your business as well as your customer.
Yeah, and
Ron, one of my favorite sayings is especially when it comes to KPIs, and we had a ton of them at Flex, as you know, but be careful what you measure and incentivize, because you'll get it.
Yeah, people might optimize on that.
Right.
Yeah, it's be careful what you wish for. And I think the other issue there is getting, as Ron Tarter says, getting alignment between the business strategy and the supply chain. They're not designed separately. If the objective and what gives you success is having the lowest cost of product, that might be what you need. If, as Ron Keith said, the objective is to get the product to market as quickly as possible, then that's a different design solution altogether in the supply chain. So,
one more quick story, if it helps. I was working with another customer who wanted to move bicycle manufacturing back to the U.S. It's predominantly in
China. Yeah.
And the issue they had is they had to customize bicycles in the U.S. So they would buy a generic bike in China, bring it over to the U.S., had kind of a postponement strategy and colors and decals and variety of things, costing them a ton of money at the postponement stage. Also costed them a ton of money because they always had the wrong bike at the wrong location. But they could not get over the cost that they paid to China for the generic. And until we could actually meet that price in the United States, they would not actually take the benefit from all the costs they had downstream in their cycle. We could not make it work. They just wouldn't accept the fact that all the postponement costs, the distribution costs, the inventory costs didn't get a credit back to the actual generic bicycle cost.
Yeah, I got it. Because they weren't looking at it holistically.
I'm sorry. Apparently it's story time now. I got to jump in here with one, and I think Medlin knows the story, but a fairly big publicly traded company, do a couple $1 billion a year. Their supply chain spends, $600 or $700 million, and based in Southern California. And they call me up, and we get a lot of calls that start with my contract manufacturer sucks, right? Even before they say hello, it's Ron Keith. Hey, my contract manufacturer sucks, which is how I know it's not my mom calling, but. So I'm like, okay, tell me about this. What's the problem? And their quality sucks and their delivery sucks and blah 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 blah. Okay, so how can I help you? Well, you need to help me find someone, that
doesn't suck.
Yeah, it doesn't suck, right? And so we do a bunch of work, and here's a good company, and here's a good company, and but they have to be cheaper. Okay, they have to be cheaper than your company that completely sucks at everything they do. right? I just need somebody that's really good but cheaper than, and this company sucked for a reason, right? I mean, they just were underinvesting in every possible thing because they had customers like this, right? They had customers that, you know, they can complain all day, but they know what my unit price is, and they cut me a lot of slack because of that, right? And you know, this guy could have spent 2% more on product and saved himself 6 points. Yeah. But he couldn't bear himself to write that check for 2% more because he knew exactly what that number was.
Yeah, and it's that confusion of price and cost, isn't it? It's the same in every single market. You know, people are looking at price, they're rewarding their supply chain and procurement team on driving price down, and they're not aware of the cost and they're not aware of the risk. Let's put you guys in an interesting position then. You've seen what's happened with COVID. You've learned through this process, you've observed it. We're now in a position where you've got to design a large supply chain going forward. So you've almost got a blank sheet of paper. You can start and do whatever you want. You've listened to the debates about reshoring, about we should have less dependence on China. We should do this, do that. There's, you know, some anti-globalization feeling, regionalization options. What would be the supply chain you would design now, and what are the key issues you think about in that design? Anybody want to take that first? Because if you go first, you get to paint the broad strokes. Ron Tarter, you're dying to speak, I can tell.
You know, because since it's a wide-ranging question, you know, obviously it starts with the product, you know, and kind of consideration of the product. When I've always seen very successful supply chains, they had a level of redundancy built into them, you know, and if I'm talking about an electronic product, a commercial or a commodity product, you know, you can't ignore what you can do in China. I always start with the objective is I want the lowest cost.
Yeah.
So I start there as I strive for the lowest cost, and then I try to understand the risk. You know, Ron gave a good example where somebody had the lowest cost, but didn't really appreciate the risk that they put into the relationship. So I start there and begin to try to understand, you know, that variation from there, and also understand maybe things as I map the supply chain. What do I want to control? You know, to me, there's things I want to control. There's things I might want to try to use and leverage organizations that have some expertise that I can benefit from. I might want to use organizations that can also help me benefit in the second and the third tier within the supply chain. So to me, it's an exercise of mapping. And as I'm looking at my product, I'm looking at where I can get the supply, and I'm looking at the second tier supply. I'm looking at the risk profile of that, and then I'm trying to pull all those things together so I get the lowest possible cost. Because in the end, you can get the lowest possible cost, but if you can't get the product when you want it, and you can't get the product to the quality level your customer wants, it doesn't matter what it costs.
Yeah.
One customer one time called me up and said, "It's very simple, Ron. What I want from you is perfect, free, and no lead time." That's what we started.
Yeah, perfect, free, and now.
And perfect, free, and now. You know, and I never forgot that. It was a good illustration. I'm sure others have heard it, but it reminded me that when we're building a supply chain, you kind of start there, and then you try to make trade-offs as you go through. But relative to electronics, you can't ignore China. You got to figure out how to reduce the risk. I always liked Mexico because you can get some good talent, and you can get some of the commodities around plastics and metal fabrication are really good there. So again, when you look at your product, those are the kinds of things
I would think one thing with, I hate to add up all the number of years of supply chain experience that this panel has, but one thing I would think of that is there's not going to be an overreaction and panic to the latest whatever said on the news, right? I mean, we're going to look at, as Ron said, the total package. We realize what's good and what's difficult, what are the risks in each of the areas. I know one thing back, Ron, you recall when I was back in Integra as the startup, we were using Taiwanese supply chain, and I reached out to Ron and said, I need a Taiwanese engineer boots on the ground in Taiwan, because that's going to help us lower our total over cost of, the product development. So it's a lot about don't overreact to what the political climate is, but
Yeah.
just be curious about what's the, and start looking at even, Ron mentioned it earlier too about regionalization. So where is the end customer?
Yeah.
And, where's that market? And, let's make sure we factor that into the supply chain question.
Yeah. So let's assume it's an innovative product. It's a global market. We're expecting high volume, but we've got a ramp, and I've still got Mark to come on this. Do you think more about supply chain diversity, for example, now than you did, and would it make you think more regionalized than maybe you would have done in at the end of last year or the beginning of this year?
Personally, I don't, because that's the way I've been wired through my career, right? COVID hasn't really changed my thoughts on that, frankly. It's created some issues, but again, those that have been able to respond quickly, and those that knew what the risk profile and what their backup plans would be, they're probably the ones, and had a little bit of inventory to play with, that didn't get it down to nothing. I love McNamara's phrase that it's the grease that drives the system. Strategic inventory in the right places, you probably fared fairly well through this. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't think about it any differently today myself. I'm sure a lot of people are, because they don't typically, I don't see a lot of supply chain managers think strategically.
Okay. That's a concern. Ron, Keith, last word on this brand new supply chain from you. And it doesn't sound like a brand new supply chain. It sounds like you guys have considered all these things in the past, and they're still important.
It's interesting. It's we also do consulting. We provide services, but we also do consulting. And people will come to us at that stage and they say, "Hey, I've got this new product. I think it's going to sell gazillions, and what should I do?" And when you map out something that is maybe a little bit more resilient or a little bit more fault tolerant, or when you're optimizing around some of the factors that are not as well known, it's amazing how you get some pushback. So when Mark says, look, this isn't new to me, I'm not thinking about things any differently. What our conversations have been, Phil, and what this this show is about is, will a lot of decision makers think about things differently, right? Because there are a lot of people that their shelves got empty, right? And if your shelf is empty and the competitor's shelf is empty, well, that's kind of okay. But if there's a high substitution effect, your shelf is empty, and I can go, "Hey, I'm going to go to this other product," and all of a sudden I've now adopted that and say, it's a better product anyway, so now you've lost me for life. And trying to quantify what the risk of that is just really, really hard. And it takes a lot of math and stuff. And to Ron Tarter's point, it also takes a lot of buy-in from different constituencies. If you've got a really big, global, Fortune 100 company, they've got a director or a vice president that gets completely bonused on PPV. What did I reduce my costs quarter over quarter? You've got someone on the logistics side that is trying to look at, what is my cost per ton per freight mile, right? You've got the guy that runs a distribution center, which is purely looking at, what is my fill rate? And if you, in a complex system, you can't optimize. If you got systems that's got 15 variables, you can't maximize any one of those variables, right? To get the optimum total solution, you have to sub-optimize some of those. And, it's hard for even some of the best companies in the world to really understand that. So even when we try and push some of these things forward in supply chain design, unless you're talking to the COO or the CEO, a lot of times there are decisions made that are suboptimal for the company, but optimal for our specific customer at the company in their specific role. And look, it pays the bills, but sometimes it's a little bit, it's a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, it's that goes back to that. Be careful what you wish for, doesn't it? And be careful what you bonus people on. That's absolutely key. I just want to pop over to a couple of questions that are coming in live from the audience. I want to just give Terry a shout out because he's been on all 3 shows and he's asked great questions. Tariffs in China. How do you factor those in when you're looking at a supply chain geography decision? Is that part of the risk profile? Do you think they're temporary? Are they something that people should be worried about? Who wants to tackle that? Ron, you're smiling. I'm going to. Both Rons are smiling, so we'll let the 2 Rons go first.
If I could predict the future, I would not be here with you right now, Phil. I think you have to think about it in this era. And I saw another question come in that maybe we'll get to about what I think about potential tariff risk in Mexico. I think the tariff risk in Mexico is low because we now have an agreement. I think tariffs could be with us in China for an extended period of time. And I also think that some of the places people might move to avoid those tariffs, should our current president get elected, might be next on the list. The current administration has this view that anybody who runs a trade surplus with the U.S. is taking advantage of the U.S. I don't know that Adam Smith or Ricardo or Barney or any of the academicians that have studied this for 300 years would necessarily agree with that, right? Nobody forces us to buy product from China, right? We buy product from China because there's an economic proposition there that works for the buyer and the seller. But I do think you have to think about tariffs more than we did, 5 years ago. And I think one of the ways of addressing that is, having some redundancy in your supply chain, having, multiple final assembly points that are unrelated to each other. And maybe you can flex some stuff back and forth if we get some unexpected tariffs. Are we going to start, putting tariffs on Malaysia? I would also look at, our trade agreements. I think anybody that's not a member of what's called the general system of preferences is probably at risk. Anybody that runs a trade surplus with us that's not a member of the GSP, I think over the next few years could find themselves slapped with tariffs.
Yeah. Ron Tarter, what were you going to say on that topic?
Everything I agree with. Everything Ron had said. I look at it as another variable in a supply chain risk that you have to kind of consider and manage. Maybe from for this individual, his business, his market, and where his company is competing, might be something you can also look at and see how your competitors are operating, because could be that the tariffs that are problematic for you could also be problematic for your competitors, and in that vein, you might be able to kind of mitigate that in the short term. But in the end, the right answer is going to be to have as much diversity as you can, so that if you have the opportunity to kind of move things around to mitigate that, the better. But it's going to be a surprise every time it comes, and your ability to kind of mitigate that will be one of your constant challenges that your leadership will be asking for.
So you got to stay up late and keep looking at Twitter.
Exactly.
That's the solution. Another question that came in from the audience from a kind of a smallish US EMS company, around the $10 million. Any advice on managing inventory supply chain? I guess we get back to that inventory question. Maybe a lot of smaller EMS companies have been hit by inventory problems or supply chain disruption from what we would call their sub-supply chain. What advice would you give to those guys? More inventory?
Well, that's a tough one for an EMS guy, especially a small EMS guy, right? You've got to start with a conversation with your customer, back to liability and liability of inventory, and you have to go to your customer and have that conversation about what kind of risk profile. And really, you get back to the supply chain risk assessment as to, I would recommend that EMS company to go do a risk assessment of a bomb or some of your highest volume bombs, or highest value bombs potentially, and sit down and look at that and figure out the areas based off of risk, kind of like an FMEA. So I look at supply chain risk assessment kind of like a failure modes effect analysis. People that are process design people understand that terminology. but then you can take risk, but you don't necessarily have to take risk on the entire BOM. You can take risk on certain areas of the BOM or a subcomponent BOM. Back to a story that Ron and I worked on last year. You know, we were actually, Ron was working this one. It was a heating element. It was one of the most critical parts to this assembly. And when you go look at the assessment, the wire is not quite unobtainium, but it's not far from being unobtainium. It was very difficult to procure, long lead times, then had to go to another processor to process it into wire. But the cost was very minimal. So, you know, go do an assessment and go buy a year's worth of supply or whatever the right number is. And it's still not going to cost you a lot.
Yeah.
So you've got to get to that place, and especially an EMS guy, they have to have that conversation with their customer, because at the end of the day, they can't get stuck with that liability. It could break them.
Yeah, and you've got to drill down, and you've got to make that risk assessment almost line by line on
Right.
the bill of materials. And you know, I kind of have a sense, and I've seen this in the past, that the smaller EMS guys, when there are component shortages and things, don't get treated quite as nicely as maybe some of the big guys. So that's a harsh reality of you know, of kind of the world we live in. But actually, part of that, Mark, is being able to see what's going on in your supply chain, and
Absolutely.
being able to see what's happening with those particular parts. And that brings me to another area I wanted to explore, which is just the tools that are available for people to use. Obviously, you know, one of the tools is to hire great guys like the people we've got on the panel here to go and do it all for me. But what are the key tools that you need to be able to run that supply chain really well? And you've done this for OEMs, but what do you see as the tools that you need to make things work? And are those tools getting better? Bill.
Oh, hated that you started with me on that question. That's a tough one. You know, I think the first thing to talk about, and Mark mentioned it, not necessarily a tool, but it is a relationship. Again, you are part of a supply chain in total, right? So it can't be a arm's length relationship of your customer and your EMS provider or your manufacturing partner, right? That has to be tied together more quickly. But I think obviously there's a lot more software programs available now, a lot more, you know, forecasting tools that are available now than were years ago, you know, from that perspective to tie in. But again, none of those tools are going to be as effective if you still have an arm's length relationship and you're just a supplier, right? There has to be that. I used to tell our guys that we need to know as much about our customers' business as they do, and they need to, you know, it's an integrate. When I was in OEM, you had all those meetings with the sales guys and the planners and the manufacturing people, because it was all geared around the same end result. Well, you need to do that same thing in the EMS space, in the total supply.
Yeah, and build that great partnership, that great relationship, and that open communication and collaboration. Ron, either Ron, really, is everybody still using spreadsheets? Do people have the tools that give them the real-time visibility they need? Because surely during this crisis, if you had the data, you were in much better a position to manage the situation.
Well, you know, we deal with, you know, pre-revenue companies. We deal with, you know, companies that do, you know, 50+ billion a year. And the people that are running kind of MRP and planning and order management on spreadsheets are not always the ones you think. I promise you that Excel remains the world's largest planning, you know, platform, which is a little bit disappointing. But, you know, when you talk about some of the tools that are out there, and Phil, maybe we should try and get these guys on sometime, but there's a company in, I want to say they're in Santa Clara, called Elementum. And they have this software. I think Ron might know these guys. They have this software platform that is around supply chain risk incidents. And, you know, without explaining how their software works, to the extent that you use their tools to go map what your supply chain is, and your supply chain isn't, I buy everything from Foxconn, right? That is a link. That is not your supply chain, right? But to the extent that you take the time to go map out the supply chain and embrace some of these tools, it's incredible the amount of visibility you can get on, specific incidents and risks. Having said that, that gets back to what Biancaniello was talking about, which is, okay, when you have this risk, Fukushima just, happened and it melted my laptop factory. You still have to have, so maybe you're 2 days ahead of everybody in terms of being able to go start working that. But if you don't have those backup plans, if you don't have second sources, if you don't have, hey, this is sole source and therefore I probably should keep some inventory in this, right? If you don't have that remediation plan ahead of time, getting advanced warning is only mildly helpful. What people really need to do is, look 3 or 4 levels back up in their supply chain, know who the suppliers are. They need to know what their risks are, what their scalability is, what their redundancy is, what, if any, inventories they keep on the FGI side, on the raw material side. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to go map it. It takes a lot of work to go constantly refresh it. But if you have it, and if you spend the extra, it can save you an awful lot of headaches, not just in COVID, but in little things. I remember a couple years ago, when those Iceland volcanoes went off, and all of a sudden, all of the air routes between, the air freight routes between, Europe and the US shut down for 3 days. Just knowing that type of stuff and go, look, if this is our normal plan for shipping stuff in from Belgium, what is our backup plan? Right. And just having those backup plans, being able to go implement them.
Yeah. No, backup plans are huge.
Hey, to add to that, sorry, I have a couple other stories here, but I found that, especially EMS companies, my experience is they don't do a good job for OEMs measuring that second, third, and fourth layer of the supply chain because they're not paid to do it. It's not part of the value add. It's not part of their transformation cost. And they're just not going to do it. And when problems happen, they're going to look to you and say, well, this is your supplier, Mr. OEM. You're the one that said, I had to go buy this component from this supplier in this location. You have to go deal with that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, we had a customer a few years ago that said, hey, I'm going to get one of the top tier EMS guys. I'm going to sign a contract with them, and then my supply chain worries will be over. And I literally laughed at the guy. I didn't mean to, but I did, because that's not the way it works, right? You've got to understand that. One other thing around tools, Philip, is I still see lots of companies that have bills of material, not on napkins, but on spreadsheets. They don't have product data management tools that can track the rev and the suppliers and the alternate suppliers. They can't spell sales, inventory, and operational planning. Some of these basic supply chain tools that we've all dealt with all of our life, people aren't even doing some of those today.
Yeah. So we can talk about Industry 4.0 all day long, but we need to get to 2.0 and 3.0 first.
Absolutely.
Before we move them on to that. Last question before we wrap up, because I'm conscious of the time. Mitigating risk by bringing certain things in-house. Someone said molding your own plastics. That's a pretty bold one to bring back in-house. But are there areas of manufacturing or of the supply chain that you just think should never have been outsourced, or you think are better off brought back in? Anybody want to grab at that?
I'll start with that, but I'll address it the opposite way. So, let's bring in our molding. That might not be the last thing you should bring in, but it's really, really damn close to the last thing you should bring in. It is a commodity. I don't care whether you're in the US or Mexico or China, there are hundreds and thousands of molders. Now, you got to, match up the right machine types and stuff like that, but it is purely a commodity. If something crashes, you can find another supplier. Now, you do have to manage your tools. Your risk is around, where are your tools? Do you have access to your tools? Who owns the tools? But there are some things that are pure commodities. And this is now reminding me of something we should do for a show. I'll walk through kind of we have this topology of how do you think about what to internalize and what not to internalize. What you internalize generally is things that, there is not a highly efficient market to outsource them to, right? And so plastics, that doesn't fit. Printed circuit boards, that doesn't fit. Banging out sheet metal, that doesn't fit. We're working with a new customer. I don't want to talk too specifically, but they have a custom heating element that has to go, or a custom connection for a heating element that has to go through this like weird accordion type of pipe. It uses very interesting materials and processes that are not just like off-the-shelf processes. Now, they have suppliers that do this, but it is something that is almost purely unique to them. I've not seen it before. And so if it's something that it's purely unique to you and you can be completely shut down without it, those are things that you can at least consider. But, commoditized production of stuffing circuit boards, shooting metal, or, shooting plastics, banging metal, that type of stuff. It's got to be something that is unique to you and incredibly strategically important.
Yeah, specialist and strategic. Before we go, guys, I'm going to come back to you, Ron Keith, last, so you can tell everybody who's going to be on the next show. But Ron, Bill, Mark, any kind of takeaway advice you would give to people in the supply chain side watching? Any kind of key things that they should be doing right now as we come out of the COVID issue? Who wants to take that first? Anybody got anything in their back pocket?
Well, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but supply chain risk assessment, right? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, everybody should be doing it. You should be doing it all the time. You should be updating it. You should always be looking at your supply chain and looking at the risks of that supply chain and trying to go have mitigating factors that you may not have a plan or you may not have a backup supplier. But if it's a part that you can bring up a supplier in a matter of weeks and you've got enough inventory to cover that, then that's your mitigating factor is I can bring up another supplier. That's what I'm going to do if this one falls short. So
and that
supply chain risk assessment.
That risk assessment. Yep. So no knee-jerk reaction. Don't panic, but do a proper risk assessment and drill down properly on that.
Yeah, and live that risk assessment.
Yeah. Bill.
I would agree with Mark. I think the other thing I mentioned earlier is don't panic over the things that are being said right now. We've been through supply chain hiccups before. We'll go through them again. It is it is still stay the course. And again, I go back to remembering that it is a chain, and it includes from customer all the way back to the raw material supplier, and the better you tighten up the relationships in that chain, the easier it is to react to the disasters that befall a supply chain issue based on whatever happens next, because there's going to be another next.
Yep, there is, and we don't know what it is. So that's what makes it interesting. Ron Tarter.
Yeah, obviously I agree with my colleagues. I might just add that I kind of look at an event like the COVID or any of the other events we've had in the past as you can look at it as negative, but also can be an opportunity. I mean, if you think about the dialogue we've been having, we've been talking about, other geographies, other regions, other locations, been talking about in-source, outsource. It allows supply chain leaders to kind of reconsider what they have, which I see as very valuable. Yeah. One of the things that Mark mentioned is something the organization doesn't get a chance to do, but it's a dynamic environment. Supply chain has to get coddled all the time, in my opinion. And if you work with it and you watch the way it changes, you put yourself in a better position to get ahead of the next event, because you can be able to respond to the event that you just experienced.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right there, Ron. It's a great time to, as a supply chain manager, to go to your board and say, hey, we need to make a few changes, because they're going to listen right now. Ron, I'll give you the mic to wrap up and to let our guests know who's going to be on in the next 2 weeks.
Very good. So I think most of you probably got a note from Phil. We're going to be doing this now on a kind of a 2-week cadence. And so next week we don't have anything. The following week, our guest is going to be, or at least our primary guest is going to be Jim Rowan. Jim is the CEO of Dyson, one of the most thoughtful OEM leaders that I know, and one of the few that kind of came up from a manufacturing and supply chain background. Right? You see a lot of people hit that spot from marketing, or a lot of people hit that spot from R&D, but Jim is going to be our guest. We're going to talk about how he has seen the supply chain evolve, what he's thinking about for the future, and he's got some pretty interesting insights that I haven't heard from anybody else. So yeah, we're looking forward to talking to Jim in a couple weeks.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting to have someone who sees it from the other side as well. Someone who's not selling contract manufacturing services, but is buying very large volumes, and not just his experience as CEO, but his experience as COO before that, and COO at BlackBerry as well, and what he built there. So very much looking forward to that. Guys, thank you so much for taking part today. It's been a really interesting discussion. For anybody watching, we're going to have a recording of this up in the next few hours, so you can pass it on to friends and colleagues. I'll get a note out to everybody about that when it's live. But Ron Tarter, Bill Biancaniello, go on, pronounce that one for me, Ron.
Biancaniello.
There you go. And Mark Medlin, thank you so much for your time. Ron Keith, always a pleasure. Look forward to talking to everybody next time. And thank you, everybody, for attending Made In. Stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.
It's been a pleasure.